Hello everyone, welcome back to Steam Code, and welcome back to our HTML for Beginners tutorial series. In this video we're going to be talking about forms. So what are forms? Forms are used to collect user input within HTML, and the user input is most often sent to a server for processing. So in order to create a form in HTML you need the form tag. So I'll explain this action attribute a little later, but just for now, have your form tag, and then the first thing within your form will most likely be a label. So what is a label? A label is simply text that exists within your form. And then you have the for attribute. The for attribute specifies which input of your form this label corresponds to, or which input will it be next to on the page, and then the text that the label contains. And I just have these BR tags to correspond with spaces after the label. So as you can see here, this is a label. It's just simply text on the page. It corresponds with this input box because the for right here corresponds with the name of the input. So now let's talk about the input. So the input needs a type. There are multiple types. There's text, radio, checkbox, and submit. For the text type that we have here, I have the ID. You guys already know what IDs are and what they stand for. The name is a little different from the ID. Within forms, each input needs a name simply because that's how they're grouped together, and that's how one is able to access different inputs within the form by accessing that name. And then what I have here is a value. There are multiple other attributes you can have. This value is just the default value of the input box. So as you can see here, if we were to reload, this 15 is automatically placed. Now that's different from the placeholder. So say we set that to placeholder. The placeholder is not a value of the input box. It just exists before anyone types anything in. So say we were to click here and then start typing, the placeholder disappears. But if we were to have the value there, so let's change that again to value, then that's an actual value of the input box. That's within the input box. Alright? So now let's look at radio buttons. So a radio button is different from a checkbox because a radio button is only allowed to select one time, or there's only one radio button within a list that's able to be selected at one time. So each radio button that we have here has a type set to radio, same input tag. The name, I set this to radio test, and then the value is the value that corresponds with that radio button. It does not need to be the same for the label that you have corresponding with the radio button. The value can be whatever you want it to be, and that's what will be submitted at the end once the submit button has been clicked. Now, for each radio button in the group that you have, all of them need to have the same exact name, or else multiple will be able to be selected at one time. So say so let's just take a look at that right now. So say we're to reload and then try to select two at one time. As you can see, that's not possible. Since they're radio buttons, only one can be selected at any one time. Now say we were to change the name of one of those radio buttons. So say this became radio tests. Then now, as you can see, only the first two have that first attribute, but then the third one can be selected as much as you want because they don't belong to the same group. They don't have the same name. And that's how radio buttons work and generally operate. Now, the next type of input for your form is the checkbox. Now, I misspelled that here. That's supposed to be check test. Now, the checkbox differs from the radio button in that you're able to check multiple boxes at one time. So the setup really is the exact same. You need a name, an ID, and a type, and a value as well. And then you need a label to correspond with it. So if we were to check that out, as you can see, multiple checkboxes are able to be selected at the same time. And this is also supposed to say third. Sorry about the typos. And as you can see, these have no correlation at all with the radio buttons because each of them belong to different groups. This is check test, and this is radio test. Now, at the end of your form, you need some way to submit your data, submit the user input. And most cases you're going to see that done with an input of type submit. Now this type submit just corresponds to this button here, and something happens once you click the button. And how do we know what happens? You're going to see this action attribute as when you declare your form element. Now this action attribute is just what's going to happen once the user submits. So here I've linked to actionpage.php. I haven't actually created it, but you're usually going to see a PHP file, and as you can see here, it produces an error when I try to click on it because it cannot find that file that I linked to within the action attribute of my form. And there's also another way you can submit data, and this is the easiest way you're going to see if they're not using the submit tag or the submit element. The other way you can do that is with JavaScript. So it's very simple. All you're going to have to do is create an event listener and listen for that on submit event for the form, and then handle that in whatever way you want, depending on the project you're making. Alright, now this has been a very basic overview of forms in HTML. I hope you all have enjoyed. I hope you learned something new, and I will see you next time. This has been Steam Code.